Thanks so much for joining us today. I have a question for you. Have you ever had somebody send you an article and as you read it, you go, wow, this individual truly captured everything that I was thinking and did it way better than I ever could? Well, I want to give a special shout out and thank you to our listener, Lisa, because Lisa forwarded a series that was being written by Professor Rajgopal around, and I'm going to read this in Forbes and we'll have it in the show notes for you. ESG, a defense, a critique, and a way forward, an evidence-driven, pragmatic perspective. And I thought this is exactly the dialogue and conversation the over 3,200 plus listeners in 60 countries, executives tackling ESG, needed to hear and be a part of this discussion. So I reached out on LinkedIn, and to my surprise, I found that Shiva Rajgopal and I had two funny things in common. The first is we both have Iowa roots. And if you're watching on YouTube, you see that I have put together my ISU, Iowa State, Go Cyclones attire, because this is a house divided on some issues. Professor Rajgopal got his PhD from the University of Iowa. He is a Hawkeye. However, I did find out he married a Cyclone, so I do think we can find some common ground today. The second fun fact that is about him is we both have a passion for practitioner scholarship. And that's just a really fancy word in the field of academia to say we believe that the practice and the voice of the practitioner matters in order to drive work forward. And so you'll find a lot of his work not only is award-winning in the academic community, but also has been published in many tier 1 media sources. Just Google his name and you'll see the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Bloomberg, Fortune, Financial Times, Business Week, and The Economist. And it's because we both fundamentally believe that there is a vibrant role for media to weigh in on the topic of environment, social governance, and the role that the academy plays to driving the research forward. So Shiva, thank you for coming on the show, and thanks for connecting on some common ground, even though we might disagree a little bit.
Oh, thank you, Mandy. And just for the listeners, I was trying to put on my Hawkeye sweatshirt, but I've gained a couple of pounds during the lockdown. So, the first thing I learned from Mandy today was buy a scarf, not a sweatshirt. So on that note, we already have a lot of common ground.
And can learn from each other, whether it's fashion or other topics, right? So good. Well, we start with two quick conversation starters. And the first one I want to dig in a little bit with you is you describe yourself as an investor advocate. Tell us why.
Well, my day job is that of an accounting professor. And the entire question that we are always trying to look at for any company is one of financial sustainability. Will this company be around? Does it deserve the valuation it's getting? How do you separate the wheat from the chaff? And it's usually from the perspective of what is called stewardship, meaning, we've given the CEO some capital. What has the CEO done for us in return? So part of it is the academic training and the orientation. The second idea, and this is more of a modern phenomenon, is that the value chain, I think linking savers to the funds, it's pretty hard to know, who's working for whom anymore, because these are agents talking to agents. So, is there really an investor advocate out there? The big three institutions are supposedly the biggest owners of stock in these companies are not really owners. They're actually custodians of our money. Maybe you can talk about maybe state pension funds because they are somewhat closer to their constituents. But in general, one has to wonder whether the gulf between the owner and the manager has become so wide, there's a big yawning gap between these two perspectives. What, if anything, is going to fill that? So, And I guess on Twitter and YouTube and so on, you need a persona. And I figured that describes a lot of what I do. So that's why I've called myself an investor advocate. It's up to you to judge whether that's right or not.
I appreciate that leaning into a persona. And you also lean into this notion that you have a very pragmatic perspective in the market as someone who has published in media as well as academia, and as you work with your students as they go out into the world. Where did this pragmatism come from?
I guess partly because I've spent in the first half of my life in India, and I, mostly grew up in a large city called Bombay, 22 million people. Resources are always a problem. So, in India, in Hindi, we have a term called jugaad capitalism. Jugaad simply means make do with what you have, because that's all you're getting. By and large, you don't get a lot of help from the state. You're up to your own devices to kind of make something of your life. India is a country where, because of the resource constraint and because we are a country of 1.3 billion people, there's not a lot of time for ideology. I mean, the politicians obviously have a lot of time for ideology, and that's what they use to win elections. But if you're a man on the street, you have to get by. So, maybe that's where my pragmatic streak comes from. And now I'm, in the American version of Bombay, which is New York, and the very same thing applies here. Maybe that's where some of the so-called pragmatism comes from.
I value that you shared that with such candor. And I do think that helps you as someone navigating this for companies to think about it from the world is not full of endless resources. And using and understanding markets like India and other places can be incredibly helpful to your career. And the global dynamic of these discussions will move people forward in their work. So in this 3-part series, you really pulled through this pragmatic side. And I love that ESG Talk is a show where we invite dialogue to create movement forward for business and society. So somebody might say, why would you invite this guy on the show? Because he kind of critiques ESG. Because as we've talked about in the show, a critique, pushback, ESG challenging in an earlier chat is so good. That is how good policy, good practice is made. So we're going to take each one of these segments in the next 15 minutes together and talk about your perspective. And you chose in part 1 to begin with a defense. You were like, let's go on defense. And you examined the anti-ESG claims. You jumped into the critique around woke capitalism, which is often a term we hear. You're so woke, you're going to take this company broke. So what were your key findings as you defended ESG in your first piece?
So in the interest of balance, right? Because I think both sides, frankly, overstate their case. And I don't know who started the fight first. And, it's kind of drowning in rancor. And nobody looks at the primary data. Why have we evolved into a world where we can say anything we want? There's barely any accountability. Does anybody actually go and check the facts? And if you check the facts, you can come up with alternate facts, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of distressing. One of the wonderful things about the US when I came here as a graduate student was this evidence-based mindset. People would actually go and try to figure out what's really going on. It's not important for me to be right or wrong. It's more important to figure out what's really going on. So having said that, let's kind of pick up this woke capitalism idea. CEOs take positions on political issues, and they eventually end up with a leftist perspective. And why would they do that? In my experience, CEOs are actually not very good, frankly, at commenting on political issues. My hypothesis is that they're doing this because of their employees. Their employees are actually pushing them to take a stand. And let's not forget, the demographic of the employee has kind of changed a lot. We've outsourced most of our production overseas, so you don't have a lot of manufacturing labor in a lot of companies. So you have highly educated college graduates. And they're very skilled, but they also have strong political views. And, in fact, and they're not happy with just having their political views. They actually want the leader of the company to take a stand about certain social political issues. So that's why you see CEOs coming out and saying things, not because they love to come out and say things. So this is very much in the line of business. It's not some crazy woke capitalism. And if that's indeed the case, what are the boards doing? As far as I can tell, most boards are quote unquote Republican. So clearly, this has to be, viewed more as a part of regular business as opposed to some kind of elaborate political conspiracy. The cost of debt for oil and gas firms is higher because of this political cancel culture that's come to investment. Well, maybe not. I mean, we've looked at this fairly carefully. So this whole negative screening idea that, ESG funds exclude, firms that, in the oil and gas space or guns or, the nuclear weapons or defense industries or tobacco, does it really make a difference to the fortunes of these firms? It doesn't really matter that much in the world of equity because somebody else is out there buying the stock if you're going to exclude these companies and sell them. So the common myth that somehow, negative screening increases cost of equity capital for these firms is not quite true. Of course, nobody could have foreseen what happened post-COVID and Ukraine and so on, and oil and gas prices kind of shot up 3 or 4 times, and now we are at the edge of a different crisis as we record this. Russia has just turned off gas supplies to Germany. So it's a very complicated issue in general, and claiming that A leads to B is usually highly naive. Frankly, we live in a multi-causal world. There are like 100 things that matter for if you see some phenomena. It's a complicated ecosystem. So to be able to narrow something down to one cause is simplistic at the very least.
I appreciate that viewpoint because I do think this is where it comes into this idea of the fiduciary responsibilities of asset managers or business owners. And as they think about what we talked about in the Challenger episode was the risk, the opportunities, and the cost. And that is a very complicated piece that you have to unpack to ensure that you are moderating for the volatility of the market, like you said, ensuring the capital returns that you need for your consumers. And oh, by the way, that probably will drive competition based on how you are deciding. So let's just be a fan of capitalism for a moment and know that that's going to move the needle forward in a very productive way. And I value that we look at it and say it's not as simple as A equals B or moves you to B. However, it's also not as complicated as we like to make it sound, which leads you into your second.
Look, I'm a professor. My job is to complicate things. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Which leads into this critique and this evidence claim that pro ESG advocates make, right? Like all of a sudden ESG is going to create alpha for everyone, which isn't necessarily true because there is risk, opportunity, and cost. So educate us. Where do the pro ESG advocates go wrong?
So somehow, let's go back and unpack the 3 letters, E, S, and G. Well, like most things, these things came out of a UN report. So a bunch of bureaucrats decided E and S and G sounds good together, and suddenly it's a brand. It acquired a life of its own. And then somewhere along the way, asset management firms discovered that it presses a few emotional buttons, or assets under management go up. We get paid as a function of fees based on assets under management. Might as well push this idea. So, for a while, the ESG trade was basically going long in technology and shorting energy. And that worked brilliantly during COVID. But once COVID receded, obviously the trade was almost doomed to fail, at least the energy part. Even without Ukraine, the demand for oil would have gone up as economies started re-gearing and picking up. So the price of oil would have gone up. So this is a distressing thing. To me, ESG is a very long run conversation. It's a 15, 20, 30, 40-year conversation. Arguably, if you're not going to be an owner for that long, maybe you shouldn't bother with ESG. And the other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of the pro ESG group is the idea that profit maximization and shareholder value maximization is a total mess. I mean, I agree that maybe it needs to be tweaked. And the 2 big reasons why is that in the current system, we effectively set the cost of natural capital to be 0. because you can extract oil, you can use forests, and you can, use water without impunity, and the cost is effectively economically by and large zero. And the second idea, we don't pay as much attention to externalities in the jargon, which simply means unintended consequences of your actions, both positive and negative. So those are two important things we should talk about. But setting that aside, to blame profit maximization and shareholder value maximization for everything that's potentially evil in the country, right? What about the political system? Is it because we think we can't make enough progress in the political system that we're now pushing companies to do these things? I think both sides overclaim their position. And I guess, I'm glad that there's still room for that kind of conversation with shows like yours, because effectively both sides complain about me and you fall in the middle, but that's okay. That's what I believe.
Yeah, you're among you're among good friends, because when you have
That's
that
good.
pragmatic viewpoint and you
Maybe it's the middle of the country, the Iowa thing.
that's true. It could be the Midwest way that we're trained in our background, but I think that's really key, is that idea of stakeholder engagement. You're so close to the future consumer, that Gen Z consumer, and you lean a little bit into the way forward in your last piece. And your closeness to that market helped you shape piece number 3. So what is the way forward? And tell us a little bit more, because you did quite a few questions you could ask CEOs. And I want to know, number one, which was your favorite question? And then how do we think about the way forward, knowing Gen Z's right here in the market?
Great point. Again, going back to my roots as an accounting professor, it's really, really difficult to excite our students about financial statements and balance sheets and income statements. And I can, bring rabbits in the class or, perform juggling tricks. They're not impressed. But if you talk about climate, wow, the whole class wakes up, it presses, something somewhere. I think they're highly, highly concerned about all the jargon, the circular economy, and what kind of legacy are we going to leave for the future? So you're right. So businesses are fabulous at solving customer problems. Ultimately, that's why they exist, right? And we get to see your customers before you do, because they go through our classes. There is something there. These people really, really care about the footprint that we are leaving on the planet. Increasingly, it's becoming harder to deny that these abnormal weather events are probably, there's something systematic going on. There may be a climate change is real. For instance, I was just reading today in the Financial Times, a place called Chongqing in China has gone through a 7 degrees centigrade increase in temperature. So maybe we should all go visit Chongqing and see, what does a 7C increase look like? Delhi, India had 121 degrees Fahrenheit, I think, in May, 121 F. It's like there's something crazy going on, and I kind of empathize with the Gen Z crowd. So if nothing else, listen to your future customers. This is for the deniers out there. They are the future voters, the future citizens. You asked about the favorite question. The favorite question probably for me is, again, without trying to stir the political pot or anything like that, this is just a curiosity. So I'm just going to read this out. How does one reconcile the actions of those who think markets can fix everything and that the government's role should be limited, with concurrent actions by the same players to limit the ability of the market to act by opposing disclosures for political reasons that would give investors the information they want to make markets work? There's a fair amount of hypocrisy here, saying, everything is efficient. Markets are not clairvoyant. They need information. So for markets to work and for governments to be, to keep their footprint at a bare minimum on society, other systems have to work. For example, we need to know a little more about political lobbying, if nothing else. There's a piece I finished with a couple of co-authors where we found that the payoff to political lobbying is 20x. R&D is 2x, 20x of late, at least in the US, you'll recognize, the regulators have become extremely gun shy. And without regulation, can we really solve the externality problem? Not really. But anyway, so one of the questions here is the contradiction. You say you're ESG if you're a CEO. Tell us everything about your influence peddling and political activities, please, so that we can get a complete picture of what are you doing for the health of the commons in general. The other issue is, do you think the shareholder model is broken? And if yes, in a pragmatic way, how does the board write a compensation contract for the CEO to fix that problem? You could go on. What is success in your mind? What's the time frame? Is it one operating cycle? Is it 1 year? Is it 3 years?
Well, I appreciate the curiosity that you have and the way that that has navigated your voice of practice, both in the media and the academy. And this 3-part series was excellently done. We'll include it in the show notes. You referenced that global perspective. I encourage, as we are in a month that highlights Climate Week and climate change and opportunities for us to engage in these issues so important to Gen Z. Simon Mundy was on our earlier chat.
I love his book.
Oh,
I've been trying to
good.
find it. I love his book. I think he should make a BBC
Yes,
show.
his
out of it or
YouTube
something.
channel is there that he talked about in the earlier chat. Such a great way for everyone to tune into what they can do as they think about this in a global context and the market. For those that want to connect more with Professor Rajgopal, you can find him on LinkedIn like I did. So thank you, LinkedIn, for that connection, or on Twitter. And we'll include that as well in the show notes. Such a pleasure to have a pragmatic view. Thank you for engaging in the dialogue, everyone. And most importantly, I hope you take away that you can have this sense of a defense of a position, a critique, and a common pathway forward. Even if you choose to be a house divided, you can always find that common ground. Thanks. We'll talk real soon.